In the picturesque town of Maplewood, nestled between the rolling hills of the Midwest, Alicia Carter had finally found some peace. She was a proud black woman who had grown up in the bustling, diverse neighborhoods of a big city, but had moved to this small, predominantly white town for a quieter life. Maplewood had a charm to it, the kind of town where the bakery knew your coffee order and where everyone greeted each other on the street. But beneath the picturesque surface, not all was as it seemed. Alicia had built her life on hard work, determination, and perseverance. Growing up with very little, she had been taught that nothing came easy, especially not for someone like her. She had graduated from college with honors, secured a good job as a financial analyst, and over the years, saved diligently to afford the luxuries that most people took for granted. One such luxury was her car, a brand new silver luxury sedan, sleek, powerful, and to her, a symbol of everything she had worked so hard for. It was early fall, the trees adorned in shades of amber and gold. Alicia had parked her car on Main Street, right outside her office. She smiled as she admired the beauty of the day, the crisp air, and the satisfying hum of her car as it locked with a chirp. It was just another ordinary morning, or so she thought. Inside her office, she greeted her coworkers, grabbed a cup of coffee, and settled into her day. But no sooner had she started working when she noticed something odd outside her window. A small crowd had gathered around her car. At first, she thought it was a simple curiosity, people admiring her vehicle as they often did. But as she continued to watch, 2 police officers arrived and began speaking with the group. Something about the way the crowd was staring, pointing, and whispering made Alicia uneasy. Curiosity mixed with a growing sense of dread as Alicia left her desk and headed outside to see what was going on. As she approached her car, one of the officers looked up and locked eyes with her. "Is this your car, ma'am?" the officer asked, his tone sharp and full of suspicion. "Yes, officer, it is," Alicia replied, trying to keep her voice calm, though she could already feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. One of the bystanders, a well-dressed, middle-aged white man, stepped forward, his face twisted in a sneer. "That car's way too nice for someone like you. I bet you stole it," he spat, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Alicia's heart sank. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the implication. Someone like you. She knew exactly what he meant. Her skin color, her very presence in a town like Maplewood, made her suspect in his eyes. She swallowed her rising anger, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattle. "Excuse me," Alicia said, her voice steady, but her eyes flashing with restrained fury. "I worked hard for this car. I didn't steal anything." The first officer stepped forward, his hand resting on his utility belt. "We received a report that this vehicle might be stolen. We're going to need to see some proof of ownership." Alicia could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, judging her, assuming her guilt before she had a chance to explain herself. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, on the defensive, all because of the color of her skin. "This is absurd," Alicia said, her voice trembling slightly as she fought to keep her composure. "I have all the paperwork in my car. If you'll just give me a moment, I'll show it to you." But as she reached for her car keys, the second officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're going to need to search the vehicle before you retrieve anything." Alicia froze, her hand hovering over her purse. "A search? You haven't even let me show you my documents yet." The man in the suit smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. "Just admit it, lady. You don't belong here, and neither does that car." A knot formed in Alicia's stomach, and she could feel her anger rising. This was racial profiling, plain and simple, and it wasn't the first time she had encountered it. But this time, the humiliation and frustration were compounded by the growing crowd, the whispers, and the accusatory glances. She was being treated like a criminal because of her skin color, and it took everything she had not to scream. "Officer," Alicia said, her voice now trembling with controlled rage, "I know my rights. I am not giving you permission to search my car without a warrant." The officer opened his mouth to respond, But before he could, Alicia heard a familiar voice from across the street. Alicia. She turned to see Grace Thompson, her lawyer and longtime friend, hurrying towards her. Grace was a fierce, no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for taking on cases involving racial discrimination and winning. She was also one of the few black professionals in Maplewood, and like Alicia, she had faced her share of prejudice over the years. "What's going on here?" Grace demanded as she reached Alicia's side, her sharp voice cutting through the tension in the air. "They're accusing me of stealing my own car," Alicia explained, struggling to keep her voice steady. "They haven't even let me show them the documents." Grace's eyes narrowed as she turned to the officers. "On what grounds are you accusing her? Has there been a legitimate report, or are you just acting on the word of some biased onlooker?" The man in the suit stepped forward again, his sneer widening. "That car is too expensive for her. It's common sense." Grace's jaw clenched, but she remained composed. "Common sense, or racism?" she shot back, her voice cold and sharp. The officers shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. They had been confident a moment ago, but now, faced with a lawyer, they seemed unsure of how to proceed. "Listen," one of the officers began, trying to sound reasonable. "We're just following protocol. We got a call about a possible stolen vehicle." "From who?" Grace interrupted, her voice rising in indignation. "This man, the one who's openly admitting his prejudice. You have no legal right to detain my client or search her property based on the baseless accusation of a bystander." The officer faltered, clearly realizing they were in over their heads. "Well, we just need to confirm." "You don't need to confirm anything without probable cause," Grace said, cutting him off. "And right now, the only thing you're confirming is your own bias." The crowd had grown silent, watching the exchange with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. The officers, sensing that the situation was quickly spiraling beyond their control, looked to each other for a way out. Grace reached into her briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. "Here's the proof of ownership for this vehicle. Alicia Carter has every legal right to drive this car. If you continue to harass her, we will be filing a formal complaint for racial discrimination and unlawful detainment." The officers glanced at each other again, their confidence now completely eroded. The crowd, once murmuring with judgment, had grown quieter, their discomfort evident. "We were just trying to do our jobs," one of the officers muttered, clearly defeated. "And your job," Grace said coldly, "is to protect and serve, not to harass and intimidate based on racial bias." Alicia stood beside her lawyer, her heart still racing, but grateful for the unwavering support. As the officers muttered an apology and stepped away from the car, she felt the weight of the encounter still pressing down on her. But as she looked at Grace, standing tall and fierce by her side, Alicia knew one thing for sure: this was far from over. The legal battle begins. The days following the confrontation on Main Street were anything but quiet. Alicia couldn't shake the bitter taste the incident had left in her mouth, the way people had looked at her, judged her, and assumed she didn't belong. The small town of Maplewood, once her escape from the chaotic city life, now felt hostile and suffocating. But Alicia had no intention of letting the incident slide. She was tired of the constant need to prove herself, tired of the endless microaggressions, and tired of being treated as less than simply because of her skin color. Grace Thompson, her lawyer and longtime friend, had been true to her word. The very next day, they were seated in Grace's office, discussing their next move. Alicia sat in the plush leather chair across from Grace's desk, still feeling the weight of the previous day's events. "We're going to file a formal complaint against the police department," Grace said, flipping through a stack of legal papers. "Racial profiling, unlawful detainment, and harassment. I want this on record." Alicia nodded, her mind still replaying the events in her head. "It's not just about me," she said quietly, more to herself than to Grace. "It's about what this represents. I'm not the first person this has happened to, and I won't be the last." Grace looked up, her eyes filled with understanding. Exactly. That's why we're not just going to file a complaint. We're going to take this as far as we need to. This isn't just about holding those officers accountable. It's about sending a message that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. Alicia's heart swelled with gratitude for Grace's unwavering support. It wasn't the first time Grace had taken on cases involving racial discrimination, but it was different when it hit this close to home. Alicia had known all too well the subtle and not-so-subtle ways racism manifested itself in her daily life. From the look she got while shopping in certain stores, to the way people crossed the street when she walked by, to the way her achievements were often downplayed or questioned. But this was different. This was public, blatant, and humiliating. As they discussed their legal strategy, Alicia's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and saw several notifications, texts from friends, missed calls, and news alerts. It seemed the story had spread quickly, and not just in Maplewood. One of the bystanders had recorded the entire encounter and posted it online. The video had gone viral. "Great," Alicia muttered, rolling her eyes. "Now everyone's going to know about this." Grace looked up from her papers, a sly smile on her face. "It's not all bad, you know. The more people know, the more pressure there is on the police department to act, and the more support you have." Alicia wasn't so sure. She didn't want to be the face of a viral controversy, but at the same time, she knew this was bigger than her. The video showed everything. The smug, condescending faces of the officers, the arrogance of the man who had accused her, and Grace's fierce defense. The comments online ranged from supportive to hateful, but there was no denying that the story had struck a chord. As the days passed, the town of Maplewood became a hotbed of tension. Some residents rallied behind Alicia, organizing peaceful protests and calling for accountability. Others defended the officers, claiming they were just doing their jobs. The local news stations picked up the story, and soon, Alicia's name was on everyone's lips. It wasn't long before Alicia received a call from the police department. They wanted to meet with her and Grace to discuss the incident. Alicia wasn't sure what to expect, but Grace was adamant that they attend. "They're feeling the pressure," Grace said, her voice calm but determined. "They know they messed up, and now they want to control the damage." The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Alicia spent the days leading up to it feeling a mixture of anxiety and determination. She knew that this meeting would be crucial, not just for her case, but for how she moved forward from this. Would they offer a genuine apology, or would it be more empty platitudes meant to make the situation go away? On the day of the meeting, Alicia dressed in her sharpest suit, her head held high. She had Grace by her side, and that gave her the strength she needed to walk into that police station with confidence. When they arrived, they were greeted by the police chief, a stern-looking man in his 50s, and a handful of other officers. Alicia immediately recognized the two officers from the day of the incident. They avoided her gaze, but she could feel the tension in the room. "Miss Carter, Miss Thompson," the police chief began, gesturing for them to sit down. "Thank you for coming in today. We want to address the incident that took place and hopefully come to a resolution." Grace wasted no time. "We're here because what happened to my client was a clear case of racial profiling and harassment. This wasn't an isolated incident, and we both know it. We want accountability, and we're prepared to take legal action if necessary." The chief's face remained stoic, but Alicia could see the discomfort in his eyes. "We understand that there were mistakes made," he said carefully. The officers were responding to a call from a concerned citizen. "However, we recognize that the situation was mishandled. And for that, we want to extend our sincerest apologies." Alicia's chest tightened. Apologies were easy, but would they be followed by real change? "The problem," Grace continued, "is that this isn't just about one mistake. This is about a culture of bias that leads to situations like this happening again and again. My client was treated as guilty from the moment those officers arrived. That's the issue." The police chief nodded slowly. We are committed to improving our training and ensuring that all of our officers are aware of implicit bias and how it can affect their judgment. Grace raised an eyebrow. That's a start, but it's not enough. We want to see concrete actions taken, not just promises, and we want a public statement acknowledging what happened and outlining the steps the department will take to address racial profiling. The chief hesitated, clearly reluctant to make such a public admission of wrongdoing. We will consider your request, he said finally. In the meantime, I can assure you that both officers involved in the incident are undergoing additional training, and we will be reviewing our protocols to prevent this from happening again. Alicia spoke up for the first time. I don't want this to be swept under the rug. I want to see real change in this town. I want people to feel safe, no matter what they look like. The chief's eyes softened slightly. I understand, Ms. Carter, and I want to assure you that we are committed to making Maplewood a place where everyone feels safe and respected. After the meeting, as they walked out of the station, Alicia felt a strange mix of emotions. The apology had been a step in the right direction, but she knew this fight was far from over. The promises of additional training and protocol reviews were just words for now. Would they follow through? Would they make real changes? Grace, sensing Alicia's uncertainty, placed a hand on her shoulder. This is just the beginning, she said softly. We've got their attention, and we're going to hold them accountable. This isn't over. Alicia nodded, her resolve hardening. She knew Grace was right. The fight was just beginning. But this time, she wasn't fighting alone. As they drove away from the police station, Alicia glanced out the window at the familiar streets of Maplewood. The town hadn't changed, not yet. But maybe, just maybe, this was the spark that would start a fire that would burn away the prejudice and ignorance that had been festering beneath the surface for too long. The town reacts. The morning after Alicia's meeting with the police, Maplewood woke to the sound of heated debates. News of the police department's apology and the possible legal action against them spread like wildfire. Some people in the town were outraged, while others, particularly the younger generation and some marginalized communities, voiced their support for Alicia's stand against racial profiling. The incident had touched a nerve, exposing deep divisions in Maplewood that had long been ignored. At first, Alicia tried to go about her routine as if nothing had changed. She woke up early, got ready for work, and drove her car down the familiar streets that now seemed to watch her with prying eyes. Her usual stop at the local coffee shop, however, didn't go as planned. As Alicia entered the shop, a tense hush fell over the few patrons scattered around the cozy space. Normally, Alicia exchanged pleasantries with the barista, who knew her order by heart, but this time was different. The barista, a middle-aged woman named Linda, who had always greeted her with a smile, looked up briefly before turning her back, focusing intently on the espresso machine. Alicia stepped up to the counter, her chest tightening with anxiety. "Good morning, Linda," she said, trying to maintain a cheerful tone. "I'll have my usual, please." Linda's response was curt. "Be a minute," she muttered, not even turning around to meet Alicia's gaze. Alicia stood awkwardly by the counter, feeling the eyes of the other patrons on her. She could hear the hushed whispers, though she tried to block them out. "That's her, the one from the video," someone murmured. "Always causing trouble, making everything about race," another voice added. Alicia's heart raced, but she kept her head high, refusing to let them see her flinch. She had expected some backlash. After all, standing up for yourself often came at a price, but she hadn't expected it to be so immediate, so personal. When Linda finally handed her the coffee, there was no warmth in her gesture, just a quick nod. Alicia forced the smile, thanked her, and left the shop, her hands trembling as she clutched the cup. Outside, the air was cool, but it did little to soothe the heat rising in her chest. She had thought Maplewood was different, that it could be her refuge from the harshness of the world. Now it felt like the town itself had turned on her. Alicia drove to work in silence, her mind racing. She wondered how many more times she'd walk into places where she was once welcome, only to be treated like an outsider. How many people in this town secretly harbored the same thoughts as the man who accused her of stealing her own car? By the time she reached her office, she was already exhausted. Her coworkers were a mixed bag when it came to the situation. Some were supportive, sending her texts of encouragement or quietly offering their solidarity. Others, however, avoided eye contact, keeping conversations brief and professional, as if they didn't want to be associated with the controversy. The tension was palpable as Alicia sat at her desk, trying to focus on her work. But the whispers around the office were impossible to ignore. "You think she's really going to sue the police?" one coworker whispered to another. "I don't know. Seems like she's just stirring up trouble." Alicia's stomach churned with frustration, but she reminded herself that this was why she was fighting. This wasn't just about her car or one bad day. It was about the systemic racism that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The people who were uncomfortable now were the ones who had never had to confront these issues before. They didn't understand what it was like to live with the constant fear of being judged, harassed, or even harmed because of the color of your skin. As the day dragged on, Alicia received a call from Grace. They had been in constant contact since the incident, and Grace had been working tirelessly to prepare for their next steps. "We've got a problem," Grace said, her voice heavy with concern. Alicia frowned. "What's going on?" "There's a group in town, a small but vocal one, that's organizing a rally. They're calling it a Back the Blue event, but it's really just an excuse to undermine our case and paint you as the villain." Alicia's heart sank. "A rally? Against me?" "Not directly," Grace clarified. "But it's clear that it's in response to what happened. They're trying to frame this as you attacking the police for doing their jobs, even though we both know that's not what this is about." Alicia leaned back in her chair, her head spinning. The thought of people gathering to support the officers who had wronged her, to paint her as the aggressor in a situation where she had simply been defending her rights, made her stomach turn. She had expected resistance, but this was different. This was organized, deliberate, and it felt deeply personal. "What do we do?" Alicia asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. "We stay the course," Grace said firmly. "Let them have their rally. It's not going to change the facts of what happened, and it's not going to stop us from pursuing justice. But it might get ugly, Alicia. You need to be prepared for that." Alicia nodded, even though Grace couldn't see her. "I'll be ready." But no matter how much Alicia tried to steel herself, the reality of the situation hit harder than she expected. Over the next few days, Maplewood became a battleground of opinions. Flyers for the rally were posted all over town, on telephone poles, in shop windows, and even in front yards. The local radio station aired segments about supporting our law enforcement, and several people wrote op-eds in the town's small newspaper, criticizing Alicia without naming her directly. "Some people just want to stir up trouble," one letter read. "This town has always been peaceful until certain individuals decided to make everything about race." Another letter was more pointed. "People need to respect authority. If the police ask you to cooperate, you cooperate. No need to play the victim." Alicia's heart ached as she read these words. She wasn't playing the victim. She had been the victim of racial profiling, of harassment, of a system that had failed her and so many others like her. But now, she was being painted as the troublemaker, the agitator, the one causing division in a town that had never truly been united in the first place. It wasn't all bad, though. For every flyer or op-ed that criticized her, there were signs of support as well. A group of young activists, many of them students from the local high school and nearby college, organized their own counter-protest. They reached out to Alicia, offering their solidarity and asking how they could help. One evening, Alicia met with them at a local community center. It was a small group, maybe 20 people, but their energy and passion were undeniable. They held signs that read, "Justice for Alicia," "End racial profiling," and "We stand with you." Some had painted slogans on their jackets or t-shirts, and a few had even started a petition calling for an independent review of the police department's practices. Alicia felt a surge of hope as she spoke with them. These were the allies she hadn't expected, people who saw her struggle and understood the broader fight. They didn't see her as a troublemaker or a victim. They saw her as someone standing up for what was right. One young woman, a high school senior named Jasmine, approached Alicia after the meeting. "I just wanted to thank you," Jasmine said, her voice soft, but filled with conviction. "What you're doing, it matters. A lot of us look up to you, even if we've never met you before. You're making a difference." Alicia blinked back tears, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." As Alicia drove home that night, she realized that the town's reaction, though painful, was a sign of something deeper. Maplewood was changing. The cracks in its seemingly perfect surface were starting to show, and with those cracks came the possibility of real transformation. But change was never easy, and Alicia knew she was in for a long, difficult fight. Still, she wasn't alone. And for the first time since the incident, that thought brought her a sense of peace. Battle lines drawn. As the day of the rally approached, tensions in Maplewood continued to simmer. The town divided into starkly opposing camps. Flyers plastered across the town invited residents to back the blue in support of local law enforcement, but the undertones of the event were clear. It was a rally not just for the police, but against Alicia and everything she represented. On the other hand, a smaller but vocal group had organized a counter-protest in support of Alicia, decrying the systemic racism that the town had long been reluctant to acknowledge. Alicia tried to keep her head down in the days leading up to the event, focusing on her work and avoiding the growing hostility that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. But the atmosphere in Maplewood was impossible to escape. She felt it in the sharp glances from strangers on the street, the cold shoulder she received at shops and restaurants, and the whispers that followed her wherever she went. On the morning of the rally, Alicia woke with a knot in her stomach. She knew the day would be hard, the kind of day that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Grace had warned her that things might escalate, and Alicia couldn't help but worry about what was to come. It was one thing to stand up for yourself in a controlled environment, like a courtroom, but it was another thing entirely to face the judgment of an entire town in the streets. Alicia spent the morning at her home, pacing back and forth, trying to decide whether to attend the rally. Grace had been clear. She didn't have to go. In fact, Grace had advised her against it. "This isn't about you being there in person," Grace had said. "This is about the message. You don't need to put yourself in harm's way. Let the protesters speak for you." But Alicia couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to be there, to witness what was happening in her own town. This fight wasn't just about the legal battle. It was about the soul of Maplewood, the place she had come to call home. How could she sit back and watch from the sidelines when the town was tearing itself apart over her experience? After much deliberation, Alicia made her decision. She dressed in jeans and a plain sweater, nothing that would draw attention, and pulled on her jacket before heading out the door. She didn't tell Grace she was going. She didn't want her friend worrying about her, but Alicia knew she couldn't stay away. As she drove toward the town square, where the rally was set to take place, she noticed the increased police presence. Squad cars were parked at every corner, and officers stood in groups, watching as people began to gather. Alicia's heart raced as she pulled into a parking spot a few blocks away and made her way toward the square on foot. The sight that greeted her as she approached was overwhelming. On one side of the square, hundreds of people had gathered, waving flags and holding signs that read "Support our police" and "No to mob rule." The crowd was predominantly white, and many of the faces were familiar to Alicia, people she had seen around town, in the grocery store, at the post office. Now they stood in solidarity, not with her, but against her. On the other side of the square, a smaller but determined group had gathered in support of Alicia. Their signs read "Justice for Alicia" and "End racial profiling now." It was a more diverse group, with young people of all races, as well as a few older residents who had lived through the civil rights struggles of the past. Alicia's heart swelled with gratitude for these people, many of whom she didn't even know, who had come out to stand up for her for justice and for the fight against systemic racism. Alicia lingered on the outskirts of the crowd, unsure of where to position herself. She didn't want to draw attention, but she also didn't want to hide. She took a deep breath and stood near a tree, watching as the tension in the square grew. The rally started with speeches from several local figures. A prominent business owner, one who had lived in Maplewood his entire life, took the stage first. His voice echoed through the square as he spoke about the importance of law and order, about respecting authority, and about how the town had always been a peaceful, quiet place until recent events had stirred up trouble. "We all know what's really going on here," he said, his voice rising as the crowd cheered. "This isn't about a car or a misunderstanding. This is about outsiders trying to come into our town and change the way we live, but we won't stand for it. We support our police, and we support the people who have made Maplewood what it is, a good, decent, hardworking town." The crowd erupted in applause, and Alicia felt a chill run down her spine. Outsiders. She had lived in Maplewood for years, paid her taxes, volunteered in the community, and yet, because of the color of her skin, she was still seen as an outsider, someone who didn't belong. The next speaker was a local politician who took a more measured tone but still managed to convey the same message. He talked about the importance of unity and respecting each other, but his words rang hollow. Alicia could feel the underlying message. Unity meant keeping things the way they had always been, where people like her were expected to stay in their place and not make waves. As the rally continued, the tension between the two groups grew palpable. The counter-protesters, led by some of the younger activists, began chanting slogans about justice and equality, their voices rising in unison to drown out the speeches from the rally. "No justice, no peace," they chanted. "Black Lives Matter." The crowd supporting the police responded with their own chants. "Blue Lives Matter," and "Respect the Police." For a moment, it felt like the entire square would explode. Alicia watched, her heart pounding, as people from both sides began to shout at each other. The police, who had been standing by the perimeter, moved in closer, their hands on their belts, ready to intervene if things got out of control. In the midst of the shouting, Alicia spotted a familiar face. It was Jasmine, the high school senior she had met at the community center. Jasmine stood at the front of the counter-protest, holding a sign that read "Justice for Alicia," and shouting with the rest of the group. Her voice was strong and clear, and Alicia felt a surge of pride. Jasmine was young, but she was brave. She wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right, even in the face of hostility. But then something happened that made Alicia's blood run cold. A man from the pro-police rally, a large burly figure in a blue jacket, pushed his way through the crowd and made a beeline for Jasmine. His face was twisted with anger, and before Alicia could react, he was in Jasmine's face, yelling at her. "Go back to where you came from," he shouted, his voice filled with venom. "You don't belong here." Jasmine stood her ground, but Alicia could see the fear in her eyes. The man's fists were clenched, and it was clear he was ready to do more than just yell. Without thinking, Alicia moved. She pushed her way through the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest, and reached Jasmine just as the man stepped closer. "Hey," Alicia shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "Leave her alone." The man turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw Alicia. "This is your fault," he snarled. "You're the one causing all this trouble." Alicia stood tall, refusing to back down. "She has every right to be here, just like you. And so do I." For a moment, it seemed like the man might strike, but then one of the police officers stepped in, pulling him back and de-escalating the situation. Alicia felt her knees go weak with relief, but the fear and adrenaline still coursed through her veins. Jasmine looked at her with wide eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Alicia gave her a small smile. "We have to look out for each other," she said, her voice steadied despite the chaos around them. The rest of the rally continued, but the moment of confrontation had cast a shadow over the event. The tension remained thick in the air, but Alicia felt a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for Jasmine, for the young activists, for everyone in Maplewood who had ever felt like they didn't belong. As the crowd began to disperse, Alicia stayed behind, watching the people leave in groups, their signs and slogans fading into the distance. The battle lines had been drawn that day, and Alicia knew that this was just the beginning. But as she stood there, in the middle of the square, with Jasmine by her side and the voices of her supporters still ringing in her ears, Alicia realized that she wasn't afraid anymore. The fight was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. A shifting tide. In the days following the tense rally, Alicia Carter's life was upended in ways she could never have imagined. The event had sparked more than just local unrest. It had caught the attention of the national media. What started as a small-town controversy in Maplewood was now making headlines across the country. The viral video of Alicia's confrontation with the police, coupled with the footage from the rally, ignited debates about racial profiling, police accountability, and the treatment of Black Americans in predominantly white spaces. Suddenly, Alicia was thrust into the national spotlight. News outlets, both local and national, wanted interviews, while social media platforms buzzed with discussions about the incident. Some called Alicia a hero, a symbol of the ongoing fight against systemic racism. Others, however, labeled her a troublemaker, accusing her of exaggerating the situation for attention. The polarized reactions were overwhelming. Alicia had never sought fame or controversy. She had simply wanted to live her life in peace, to enjoy the quiet town she had worked so hard to call home. But now, peace seemed like a distant memory. Everywhere she went, people recognized her. Some offered words of support and solidarity, while others sneered or muttered insults under their breath. The pressure of being at the center of such a divisive issue was beginning to weigh heavily on Alicia. Despite her strong exterior, the constant attention and scrutiny were taking a toll on her mental and emotional well-being. She spent nights tossing and turning, her mind racing with questions and doubts. Had she done the right thing by standing up to the police? Was she really helping to change anything, or was she just stirring up more hatred and division? One evening, as Alicia sat in her living room, staring blankly at the news coverage of the rally, her phone buzzed. It was Grace, her lawyer and closest confidant during this ordeal. "You okay?" Grace's voice was gentle, but there was an underlying note of concern. She had seen how the pressure was affecting Alicia, and she knew her friend well enough to sense when things were becoming too much. "I don't know," Alicia admitted, running a hand through her hair. "It's just a lot. I didn't ask for any of this, Grace. I just wanted to live my life, you know. And now it feels like the whole world is watching, judging, waiting for me to mess up or prove them right." Grace sighed. "I know it's hard, Alicia, but you've got to remember why you're doing this. This isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's ever been treated the way you were. You're making a difference, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." Alicia nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. "I just feel so tired," she said quietly. "And it's not just the attention. It's the hate. I thought people would understand, but it seems like there are so many who don't. They think I'm the problem, that I'm making this into something it's not." Grace was silent for a moment, and then she said, "That's because people are afraid of change. They don't want to admit that racism exists, especially not in a place like Maplewood. But that doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means the fight is harder than we thought." Alicia appreciated Grace's words, but the truth was, she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep fighting. Every day felt like a battle for her dignity, her truth, and her right to simply exist without being judged or harassed because of her skin color. The next day, Alicia's world shifted again. She woke up to find that a prominent civil rights organization had taken notice of her case. They had released a statement condemning the police department's actions and calling for a federal investigation into racial profiling in small towns like Maplewood. The statement was powerful, and it resonated with many people who had been following Alicia's story from afar. As the news spread, Alicia received an unexpected call from an even more unexpected person, Congressman Daniel Price, a well-known advocate for social justice and criminal justice reform. "Alicia," he began, his voice steady and calm, "I've been following your story, and I want you to know that what you're doing is important. You're standing up against a system that has been allowed to operate unchecked for far too long, and that takes real courage." Alicia was stunned. She had heard of Congressman Price, of course. His work on behalf of marginalized communities had earned him national recognition. But she never expected to hear from him personally, let alone receive his support. "I just wanted to live my life," Alicia said, her voice betraying her exhaustion. "I didn't want to become a symbol or a movement." "I understand," Price replied. "But sometimes the fight chooses us, even when we don't ask for it. And right now, your voice is helping to shine a light on something that needs to change. That's why I want to help you. My office is prepared to back your case, and we're working on legislation that addresses the very issues you're facing: racial profiling, police overreach, and the systemic biases that plague our communities. Your case could be the catalyst for real change." Alicia listened in awe. It was hard to wrap her mind around the idea that her small-town ordeal was becoming part of a larger movement for justice. It was overwhelming, but also empowering. For the first time in days, Alicia felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. She had allies, and her story was resonating far beyond the borders of Maplewood. As the congressman spoke, Alicia realized something else. This was about more than just her personal experience. This was about creating a future where no one else had to go through what she had gone through, where people could live without fear of being judged by the color of their skin or the make of their car. When the call ended, Alicia sat in silence, letting the weight of it all sink in. She was still tired, still anxious about what was to come, but now there was a renewed sense of purpose. Over the next few days, as Alicia's case gained more attention, allies began to emerge from unexpected places. Several local businesses, initially hesitant to take a stance, publicly supported Alicia, calling for unity and an end to the racial tensions that had divided the town. Community leaders who had once remained silent now spoke out, urging residents to confront the uncomfortable truths about racism in their own backyard. One evening, as Alicia walked through the town square, she saw something that nearly brought her to tears. A group of townspeople had gathered in front of a mural that had been painted on the side of a building. The mural, which had been started by local artists, depicted Alicia standing tall and proud, her hand outstretched toward a diverse group of people, symbolizing hope and unity. Above the image, bold letters read, "Justice for All." Alicia stood in awe, watching as people of all ages and backgrounds came together to admire the artwork. Some of the same faces that had once been cold or indifferent now looked at her with a newfound respect. It wasn't universal. There were still plenty of people who opposed her, who clung to their prejudices and refused to see the truth. But the tide was beginning to turn. As Alicia stood before the mural, she was approached by Jasmine, the high school senior who had stood by her side during the rally. Jasmine's eyes were bright with excitement as she looked up at the mural. "They did this for you," Jasmine said softly. "You've inspired so many people, Alicia. You're making a difference." Alicia smiled, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "It's not just for me," she said. "It's for all of us. We're in this together." Jasmine nodded, her expression serious. "We are. And we're not going to stop until things change." As the two women stood there, side by side, Alicia realized that despite the challenges ahead, she had found something she hadn't expected. A community of people who believed in her, who were willing to fight alongside her for a better future. The days ahead would not be easy. There would be more battles to fight, more opposition to face. But Alicia knew now that she wasn't alone. And that knowledge gave her the strength to keep going. The courtroom showdown. The morning of the trial dawned with a heaviness that Alicia Carter could feel deep in her bones. It had been months since the incident in Maplewood had ignited a firestorm of national attention. Now, Alicia's fight for justice was about to reach its climax. In a courtroom packed with onlookers, reporters, and a jury whose verdict would reverberate far beyond the walls of the courthouse, Alicia stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the collar of her blazer. She looked into her own eyes and saw the exhaustion etched into her face, the sleepless nights, the weight of the countless eyes watching her, judging her. But there was also strength in that reflection. She had come so far, stood up not only for herself, but for all those who had been silenced, dismissed, or marginalized. As she prepared to leave, her phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "I'm here. Ready when you are." Alicia took a deep breath, grabbed her bag, and headed out the door. Grace had been her rock throughout the entire ordeal, navigating the legal complexities and standing by her side, fiercely defending her rights. Now, they were about to face the biggest challenge yet. The courthouse was a large, imposing building made of gray stone, its steps flanked by reporters with cameras flashing incessantly. As Alicia and Grace arrived, they were met by a crowd of supporters who had gathered to show solidarity. Signs reading "Justice for Alicia" and "End Racial Profiling" filled the air, and the chants of the crowd provided a rhythmic background to the tension in Alicia's heart. But across the street, another group had gathered. Their signs were different. "Back the Blue" and "Support Our Police" stood starkly in contrast to the messages of unity and justice. The divide was clear, and the tension between the two groups was palpable, even from a distance. Grace placed a reassuring hand on Alicia's shoulder as they made their way up the courthouse steps, through the throngs of people, and into the building. Alicia could feel the weight of every stare, from the crowd, from the police officers guarding the doors, and from the media whose coverage would shape public perception of this case. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was quieter, but no less charged. The room was packed with spectators, many of them townspeople from Maplewood who had been following the case from the beginning. Alicia recognized some of the faces, people who had once been her neighbors, her co-workers, her community. Now, they sat on either side of the courtroom, divided by their opinions of what had happened that day on Main Street. The courtroom itself was grand and intimidating, with tall wooden benches and a judge's seat that loomed over the proceedings. The judge, a stern-looking man in his 60s, entered the room, and the bailiff called the court to order. Alicia's heart pounded as she took her seat beside Grace, trying to calm her nerves. The prosecution, representing the police department, was led by a well-known local attorney named John Peters. He was slick, confident, and skilled at twisting facts to suit his narrative. Alicia had seen him in action during the pretrial hearings, and she knew he was a formidable opponent. As the trial began, Peters wasted no time in laying out the police department's defense. He framed the entire incident as a misunderstanding, an unfortunate but necessary police procedure that had been blown out of proportion by Alicia's reaction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Peters began, his voice smooth and polished, "this case is about a simple misunderstanding. The police officers in question were acting in accordance with their training and the information they were given at the time. They received a report of a suspicious vehicle, and they responded as they were trained to do. This is not a case of racial profiling. This is a case of law enforcement doing its job." He gestured toward the officers who had detained Alicia, both of whom sat on the opposite side of the room, looking uncomfortable but resolute. Peters continued, painting the officers as public servants who had been unfairly vilified by the media and Alicia's supporters. He emphasized their years of service, their dedication to keeping Maplewood safe, and how difficult their jobs had become in the wake of the controversy. "The police," Peters said, "are not the enemy. They are here to protect and serve." And on that day, they were simply doing their job. Alicia clenched her fists beneath the table, anger bubbling in her chest. It was infuriating to hear her experience reduced to a misunderstanding, as if the humiliation, fear, and pain she had endured were just unfortunate consequences of routine police work. When Peters finished his opening statement, it was Grace's turn to speak. She rose from her seat with the calm, confident demeanor that Alicia had come to admire and walked to the center of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Grace began, her voice firm but full of empathy, "what happened to my client, Alicia Carter, was not a misunderstanding. It was a clear case of racial profiling, and it is part of a larger pattern of systemic bias that affects communities of color across this country." Grace's words echoed in the silent courtroom, each sentence hitting with the weight of undeniable truth. The officers didn't stop Alicia because they had probable cause. They didn't stop her because they had evidence of any wrongdoing. They stopped her because of one thing: the color of her skin. In their minds, a black woman driving a nice car didn't fit the image they had of who should live in this town, and so they assumed she must have stolen it. Grace gestured toward the jury, her voice rising with conviction. "This isn't just about one day, one incident. This is about the lived experience of millions of people in this country who are judged not by their character, but by their appearance. This is about a system that has allowed bias to fester unchecked for far too long. And today, we are here to hold that system accountable." The courtroom remained silent as Grace returned to her seat, but Alicia could feel the shift in the room. Grace's words had landed, and now, the real battle was about to begin. Over the next several days, witnesses were called to the stand. The prosecution relied heavily on the testimony of the two officers involved in the incident. They claimed they had no choice but to investigate the report of a stolen vehicle and that they had followed procedure to the letter. Peters emphasized their professionalism, their lack of malice, and the difficult situations police face every day. But Grace dismantled their arguments with precision. During cross-examination, she pointed out inconsistencies in their stories, showing that their decision to detain Alicia had been based more on assumptions than evidence. Grace also called on several experts to testify about the prevalence of racial profiling in law enforcement, providing statistics and studies that illustrated the systemic nature of the issue. The turning point came when Alicia herself took the stand. The courtroom was tense as she walked to the witness box, every eye fixed on her. Alicia had rehearsed her testimony with Grace, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of sitting before a jury, telling the world what had happened to her. She spoke clearly, recounting the events of that day. The suspicion in the officer's eyes, the condescending tone of the man who had accused her, the fear that gripped her when they told her she couldn't even retrieve her own documents. She described the humiliation of being treated like a criminal for no reason other than her appearance, and the rage she felt as she realized this wasn't just about her. It was about a system that allowed people to judge her simply because of her skin color. Alicia's voice shook at times, but she didn't falter. She spoke from her heart, laying bare the pain and frustration that had haunted her since that day. "I worked hard for everything I have," Alicia said, her voice steady but emotional. "I earned that car, just like I've earned everything else in my life." But to those officers, none of that mattered. All they saw was a black woman who didn't belong. When Alicia finished, the courtroom was silent. She could see the jury members exchanging glances, their expressions unreadable but thoughtful. She had done everything she could. Now, it was up to them. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides made their closing arguments. Peters reiterated that the officers had simply been doing their jobs, that Alicia's claims of racial profiling were based on assumptions rather than facts. But Grace's closing argument was a powerful reminder of why they were there. "This is about accountability," Grace said. "It's about ensuring that no one, regardless of their race, is subjected to the kind of humiliation and fear that Alicia experienced. It's about making sure that we, as a society, confront the biases that still exist in our institutions and take responsibility for creating a more just future." The jury deliberated for hours, and every minute felt like an eternity. Alicia sat with Grace in the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly together. waiting for the verdict that would determine not just the outcome of her case, but the message it would send to the world. Finally, the jury returned. As the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict, Alicia held her breath. "We find the defendants liable," the foreperson said, "for racial profiling and unlawful detainment." Alicia exhaled, tears welling up in her eyes. The fight had been long, painful, and exhausting, but in that moment, it was worth it. She had won, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been judged, discriminated against, or marginalized because of who they were. Grace squeezed her hand, and Alicia knew this was only the beginning. The fight for justice wasn't over, but now they had momentum. The tide was turning, and Alicia was ready to continue the battle.